The sun bled across the horizon, staining the dry, unforgiving land in shades of copper and rust. Dust as fine as powdered bone settled over everything at the Double C Ranch, a solitary outpost in the vast expanse of the Arizona Territory. It was a land that demanded resilience, a place where life and death were separated by the sharp edge of a blade. In this harsh wilderness, a woman weathered by time and hardened by solitude was about to discover that even the smallest act of mercy could stir the thunder of 100 war ponies, and that the greatest dangers don't always come from the places you expect. Her name was Elara, and this is the story of the day her world was torn apart. Elara Wade was no stranger to hardship. Widowed for 5 years, she clung to the ranch her husband Boone had poured his blood and soul into. The Double C wasn't grand, just a modest adobe house, a sturdy barn, and a corral that seemed to hold more dust than cattle. Tombstone, a day's ride away, was a 2-day journey. Solitude was her constant companion, broken only by the lowing of her few remaining cattle, the nicker of her steady mare, and the whisper of the wind through the saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels on her land. Life in the territory was an ongoing struggle with the land and the ever-present threat of violence. The Chiricahua Apache, driven from their ancestral land, were a force to be reckoned with. Their raids were a harsh reality for settlers who dared to push deeper into their domain. Elara had heard the stories, the whispers of ghost-like warriors who moved without sound and fought with the ferocity of cornered lions. She had seen the fear in the eyes of men who'd faced them and lived to tell the tale. She kept a loaded Winchester rifle above her hearth and a Colt Peacemaker at her hip. Their cold weight was a constant reminder of the world she lived in. The day had been a scorcher, the kind that shimmered in the air, making the rocks sweat. Elara spent the morning mending a fence that had been broken by a stray bull, her hands raw and her back aching. By late afternoon, the sun was a scorching eye in a bleached white sky. As she led her mare back toward the barn, a flicker of movement near the dry creek bed at the edge of her property caught her eye. It wasn't the familiar lope of a coyote or the skittish dance of a jackrabbit. This was something else. Her hand instinctively went to her Peacemaker, her thumb resting on the hammer. She squinted, her blue eyes the color of a faded prairie sky narrowing against the glare. A man was crawling, his movements slow, agonizing, a desperate struggle against the pull of the earth. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stains spreading across his buckskin leggings. Blood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. He was Apache. The single feather tied in his long dark hair and the intricate beadwork on his moccasins were unmistakable. Every instinct, every cautionary tale she had ever heard screamed at her to turn back, to bolt the door and wait for the perceived threat to pass. He was likely a raider, perhaps wounded in a skirmish with prospectors or another settler. Helping him could invite disaster. His comrades could be waiting, lurking nearby, watching for an opportunity. She stood frozen for a long moment, the internal conflict a tempest within her. The man collapsed, his face hitting the dust. He didn't move. The sun beat down mercilessly. Thirst, she knew, was a cruel and efficient killer in this land. It would drain the life from a man faster than any bullet. Boone's voice echoed in her mind, a ghostly whisper. "There's a difference between being cautious and being cruel, Elara. We ain't savages." With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, Elara made a decision. It defied logic, flew in the face of self-preservation, but leaving him to die alone in the sun felt like a betrayal of her own humanity. She strode back to the well, her movements deliberate, almost defiant. She drew a bucket of cool, clear water. The sound of the rope against the wood echoing in the still air. She filled a tin dipper and started toward the creek bed, the Winchester now cradled in her other arm. She wasn't a fool. Mercy and caution would have to walk hand in hand. As she drew closer, the details of the man became clearer, more harrowing. He was young, no older than 20. His face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, with a deep, ragged gash running down his thigh, the source of the blood that had stained the dust crimson. His lips were cracked and black, his breathing shallow. He was barely conscious. She stopped a few feet away, her rifle still held ready. "Water," she said. Her voice was raspy from the dust and disuse. His eyes flickered open, dark and fever-bright. They fixed on her not with the hatred she might have expected, but with a raw, primal desperation. He tried to push himself up, a low groan escaping his lips. But his strength failed him. Slowly, cautiously, Elara extended the dipper toward him. Her hand trembled slightly. This close she could see the intricate patterns of his beadwork, the smooth, worn leather of his clothes. He was a person, not just a faceless threat. He was someone's son, someone's brother. He watched her every move, his gaze unwavering. With a surge of effort, he reached out his fingers and closed them around the dipper. He drank deeply, the water spilling down his chin and soaking into his chest. He drained the dipper, his Adam's apple bobbing with each swallow, before letting his head fall back into the dust. His eyes fluttered shut, a momentary respite from the pain, as if the water had brought him back from the brink of death. Elara refilled the dipper, and he drank again, this time slower, savoring the cool liquid. It seemed to revive him, a flicker of life returning to his dark eyes. He looked at her, his gaze intense, but it wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that crossed the divide between their two worlds. He spoke then, his voice a hoarse whisper, the words foreign and rough to her ears. He pointed to his wounded leg. Elara understood even if she didn't speak his language. She wasn't a healer, but she knew how to tend to a wound, how to stitch up a tear in flesh, just as she would fabric. It was another risk, another step further into territory from which there might be no return. She tore a strip from her spare petticoat, something she kept in her saddlebag. Pouring some of the precious water onto the cloth, she set to work, cleaning the wound. It was worse than she'd thought. Deep and raw, the flesh already beginning to swell and darken. He winced, his body tensing at her touch. But he didn't cry out. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, silent, yet more powerful than any shout. As she worked, she noticed something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Tucked into his waistband was a knife, its handle carved from the bone of some large animal. The blood stains on the blade were fresh, not yet dried to a dull brown. This was a warrior who had recently seen battle and whose blood was on that knife, likely a settler's or a soldier's. When she finished, she bound the wound tightly with a clean cloth. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the land. The cool of night would soon take over, and the coyotes and desert chill would finish what the sun and his wound hadn't. With a deep sigh, as if she were carrying the weight of her own fears, she made another decision. "Can you stand?" she asked, knowing he might not understand her words, but hoping he could understand the gesture. She pointed to her horse, then to the ranch house, silhouetted against the dying light. He seemed to understand. With a sharp nod, he struggled to his feet, his arm draped over her shoulder. He was heavier than she expected, his body all muscle and bone. His proximity was unnerving, the smell of sweat, blood, and something wild filling her senses. They moved slowly, every step a heavy reminder of the gamble she was taking. She half carried, half dragged him into the sparsely furnished house, laying him down on the cot in the corner, the cot that had once been Boone's. The irony wasn't lost on her. She gave him more water and a piece of dried jerky, which he ate slowly, never taking his eyes off her. In the flickering lamplight, an unspoken truce seemed to form between them, a fragile peace born out of necessity and shared vulnerability. She dressed his wound again, this time using a poultice of herbs she kept for her livestock. He didn't speak, his silence a heavy presence in the small room. As the night wore on, he fell into a feverish sleep. Elara sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, her senses straining to catch any sound from the darkness outside. She couldn't sleep. She wouldn't. She had invited a wolf into her home, and she could only pray it wouldn't devour her. She had given water to a wounded Apache, unknowingly setting in motion a series of events that would change her life. and the fate of the Double C Ranch forever. The real test she knew would come with the dawn, and she had a terrible feeling she wouldn't be facing it alone. The name Jada, the greater Apache chief, echoed in her mind, a name synonymous with fierce resistance and a deep, if rarely shown, sense of honor. What kind of man had she just saved? A follower of Jada's path, or something far more dangerous? The question hung in the air, as heavy and oppressive as the desert heat. The first light of dawn would bring her answer. The night passed in a long, tortured vigil. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind through the brittle bushes, sent fresh waves of adrenaline through Elara's tired body. She sat ramrod straight in her rocking chair, the cold comfort of the Winchester across her lap. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on her weary eyes, transforming familiar shapes into menacing figures. The Apache warrior, whose name she didn't know, tossed and turned on Boone's cot. His fevered murmurs constant and unsettling in a language she couldn't comprehend. Was he calling for his mother, his wife, or was he reliving the bloody conflict that had left him wounded? And at her mercy, Elara replayed the events of the previous day over and over in her mind, each time with growing dread. The rational part of her brain screamed at her foolishness. She had broken the unwritten rule of survival in the sand: never engage, never trust, never show weakness. The stories of Apache raids were brutal lessons learned by every settler. They spoke of stolen livestock, burned homesteads, and lives cut short with savage finality. Yet when faced with the reality of a dying man, another human being suffering before her very eyes, she had chosen compassion over caution. In the oppressive stillness of the night, Elara was forced to face the consequences of her choice. The blood on his knife gnawed at her, fresh and unsettling. Who had he killed? Was she harboring a murderer? The thought twisted in her stomach like a venomous snake. She had seen the set of his jaw, the pride of a warrior, a pride that even injury and fever couldn't entirely erase. This was a man not used to helplessness. As the first light of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, painting it in shades of gray and lavender, a new sound reached her ears. At first it was so faint she almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but it grew steadily, a low rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the earth itself. It was the sound of horses, many horses. Elara's blood ran cold. She rose from her chair, stiff and slow, every muscle protesting the long, sleepless night. Her heart raced as she crept to the small window, peering through a crack in the curtains. And then she saw them. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. They were everywhere. Dozens of Apache warriors, mounted on wiry, powerful ponies, had silently surrounded her small ranch house. They sat motionless, their dark figures silhouetted against the faint light of dawn. Spears tipped with flint and steel glinted like deadly stars in the early morning light. Rifles rested across their laps, their faces painted for war-grim, unreadable masks. They were the embodiment of every fear she'd ever known. They made no move to attack. They simply sat there, their presence a suffocating weight. It was a siege, quiet and patient, a declaration of power without a word spoken. They were waiting for what a wave of nausea washed over Elara. This was it, the price of her mercy. They had tracked their fallen comrade to her doorstep. They must have thought she had captured him, perhaps even harmed him. They were here for retribution. Her gaze darted to the man on the cot. He was still asleep, oblivious to the ring of death closing around them. A bitter, hysterical laugh threatened to escape her throat. She had saved him from the desert only to lead them both into a more certain demise. Panic gripped her, sharp and cold. Her first instinct was to run to Saddle Bess and flee into the desert. But where could she go? They would catch her before she'd gone a mile. Her ranch, her home, the last thing she had left of Boone, was now a trap. She glanced at the Winchester in her hands. She had maybe 20 rounds of ammunition. What good would that do against so many? It would be a futile gesture, a bloody defiance at best. The silence stretched unbearable, taut with tension. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her house like skeletal fingers. The warriors remained as still as statues. Their patience was chilling, a testament to their discipline. They were hunters, and she was the prey. Elara's mind raced, scrambling for any option, any hope. Should she try to communicate with them? Call out that the man inside was alive, that she had helped him. But what if they didn't speak English? What if they saw her as a liar? Every word could be misinterpreted. A single mistake could ignite this powder keg. She backed away from the window, her breath shallow and ragged. The small familiar space of her home now felt like a tomb. The scent of the herbs she'd used on the warrior's wound, which had seemed so wholesome the night before, now smelled of death. She looked at the wounded Apache again. In the growing light, his face seemed younger, more vulnerable. Was he the key? Could he speak for her? Could he explain? Could he avert the coming storm? But he was still deep in fevered sleep. Waking him could be dangerous, and there was no guarantee he would or could help her. The sun was fully above the horizon now, its light flooding the house. The heat of the day was already beginning to rise, and with it came a terrible certainty. The time for waiting was over. Something had to give. A new sound broke the silence. A single powerful voice from the circle of warriors called out a sharp, guttural cry that seemed to pierce the very air. It wasn't a war cry. It was a name. At the sound, the wounded man stirred. His eyes fluttered open. He pushed himself up, his movements weak but determined. He heard the call, and in his eyes, as he looked at Elara, she saw not the dazed confusion of a man waking from a fever dream, but a sudden, sharp understanding. He knew why they were here. As their gazes locked, a chilling new possibility began to dawn in Elara's mind, something far more complex and terrifying than simple revenge. The warriors outside weren't just here for him. His presence inside her home meant something more, and there Elara stood right in the middle of it. Keon, still struggling, managed to sit up on the cot. His movements slow, but there was a new urgency in his eyes. The call from outside had sparked something inside him, like a fire reigniting in his soul. His fever had broken, replaced by a sharp intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He looked at Elara, and for the first time his gaze was completely clear. His voice was rough but steady as he spoke the Apache words, flowing with a rhythm that was foreign and commanding to her ears. He pointed toward the door, then to himself, and then to Elara. He made a slight nod, a gesture of respect. Before Elara could even comprehend this, Keon swung his legs off the cot, using the wall for support as he limped toward the door. Raw terror seized Elara. "No, wait," she whispered urgently. "They'll kill us both," she muttered, her voice tight with fear. Keon paused, his hand resting on the simple wooden latch. He turned his dark eyes to meet hers. He didn't speak, but his gaze was clear. It told her without words to trust him, an idea so absurd in that moment that she almost laughed. Trust the man whose kin could end her life in an instant. With a deep, steadying breath, Keon lifted the latch and pushed the door open. He stepped into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, his silhouette framed in the doorway. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. She rushed to the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame, bracing herself for the inevitable gunshot, or the sickening thud of a spear. But to her shock, the eruption of violence she expected never came. A collective murmur rippled through the Apache warriors gathered outside. They shifted on their ponies, a wave of movement that passed through the silent ring of men. The one who had called out a towering figure with a weathered face and a magnificent eagle feather headdress dismounted. He strode forward, each step radiating an air of absolute authority. This was their leader. Keon stood tall despite his injury and began speaking, his voice rising and falling as he told a story. Elara watched, mesmerized, from the window as he pointed to his bandaged leg, then to the dipper she had left by the well. He mimicked the act of drinking, cleaning his wound. As he spoke, Elara began to understand not his words but his intent. He wasn't just recounting events. He was defending her. The leader listened, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on Kian's face. When Kian finished, a heavy silence fell. The leader's gaze shifted, moving past Kian to the open doorway where Elara stood. His eyes were deep, penetrating, as if he could see right through her. Elara's heart pounded in her chest and fear rippled through her, but she held his gaze chin high. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. Her defiance was a fragile shield against the overwhelming power of the moment. Then the leader spoke to his warriors in a low, commanding rumble. And then the most astonishing thing happened. One by one, the warriors began to dismount. They didn't lower their weapons, but the act of placing their feet on the earth seemed deliberate, symbolic. The immediate threat of attack dissolved, replaced by a tense, unnerving stillness. The leader approached the house, stopping just a few feet from the doorway where Kian now leaned heavily against the frame. The two men spoke in a quiet, intense exchange. The leader's eyes flickered to the vast, empty plains to the south, a troubled look crossing his face. Then Kian turned to Elara and beckoned her forward. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to bolt the door and barricade it. But her legs, as if moving on their own, carried her forward. She stepped onto the porch, the sun warm on her face, the scent of dust and horses thick in the air. She was surrounded by at least 40 armed Apache warriors, yet for the moment she was unharmed. Kian spoke to her again, but this time he used a few broken words of Spanish, a language she recognized from the Vicaros who passed through from time to time. "My name is Kian," he said, touching his chest. He then gestured to the imposing leader. "This is my father, Jeddah." The name hit Elara like a physical blow. Jeddah, the legendary chief of the Chiricahua Apache. A name that struck fear and awe into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. He was a myth, a phantom known for his guerrilla tactics, an unwavering resistance to the encroaching white man. And now he was standing on her porch. She had not just saved any warrior. She had saved the son of the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. Jeddah stepped forward, his eyes flecked with gray, showing an unexpected depth of weariness. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant. Kian translated his halting Spanish. "My son tells me you gave him water when he was dying." Jeddah said, his words heavy with gratitude. "You gave him shelter. You tended his wound. You did not act as an enemy." Elara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "For this," Jeddah continued, his gaze unwavering, "you have my gratitude. The Chiricahua do not forget a debt of honor. You and your ranch will not be harmed by my people. You are under my protection." A wave of relief so deep it almost made Elara weak washed over her. But it was short-lived. The twist had come, but it was not the one she had expected. The drama wasn't about revenge, but something much more complicated. Jeddah's expression darkened. He gestured again to the south. "We're not here for war with you," he said, his words carrying a heavy new weight. "We're here because of them." Kian struggled to find the right words in Spanish. "Soldiers?" Elara asked, trying to understand. No, Kian shook his head. "Not soldiers. Worse. Men. With yellow eyes. Gold hunters. They poisoned the water. They killed the buffalo for sport. They disrespect the land." He went on to explain. A new band of ruthless prospectors had settled near a place the Apache considered sacred, a series of natural springs called Ojo Caliente. These men weren't just hunting for gold. They were systematically destroying the land, driving the game away, and most critically, fouling the only reliable water source in the region. Kian had been wounded scouting their numbers. "They've brought sickness," Jeddah said, his voice thick with anger. "Our children grow ill from bad water. Our women weep. We've tried to drive them out, but they have many long guns. They're well supplied." Elara suddenly understood. The warriors weren't here to harm her. They had surrounded her ranch because it had the only clean well nearby, a lifeline to Ojo Caliente. They hadn't come to kill her. They'd come to secure the water. Elara's act of kindness to Kian had shifted their mission. What could have been a violent raid had turned into a plea for help. "We need water." Jida said his request both a plea and a command. "For our families, for our children who are dying." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elara's feet. She glanced from the legendary chief's face to the grim expressions of his warriors, then to the small well that was the only source of water on her land. She had a choice: refuse and turn her back on dying children, breaking the fragile peace she'd just been granted. But to agree would mean openly siding with the Apache. It would make her an enemy of the prospectors and a pariah in her own town. Tombstone would see her as an Indian lover, a traitor to her own people. If the prospectors found out, they wouldn't be as merciful as Jida. She had given water to one wounded Apache. Now his entire tribe, led by their powerful chief, was asking for the same. Her ranch was no longer just her home. It had become the battleground in a war she never asked to join. The next word she spoke would decide her fate and the fate of many others. The silence that followed Jida's request was thick with consequence. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the parched earth, and Elara could feel every eye of every warrior on her. They were no longer a faceless mob, a threatening force. In Jida's weary face, she saw not a savage, but a father. In the eyes of his men, she saw not bloodlust, but a grim determination to protect their own. Elara's eyes locked on the well, the simple stone and wood structure that was the lifeblood of her ranch. It was her salvation, her independence. Now it was being requested to serve as the salvation for those her people considered enemies. To say yes was to draw a line in the sand, to choose a side in a war she had tried so hard to ignore. To say no was to condemn children to die slowly, agonizingly, from thirst and disease. It would be to betray the very humanity that had prompted her to help Kian in the first place. Boone's voice echoed in her mind, steady as ever. "Right is right, Elara. Even if it ain't easy, especially when it ain't easy." She took a deep breath, dust filling her lungs, and met Jida's gaze. "You can have the water," she said, her voice steady and clear, surprising even herself. Kian translated, and a murmur rippled through the warriors. Jida's stern face softened ever so slightly, a flicker of relief passing through his tired eyes. He gave a sharp nod. "You will not be sorry." Kian translated his father's words. "The debt grows." What happened next was so surreal, Elara felt as though she were dreaming. Under Jida's direction, the Apache warriors, once a silent, menacing army, transformed into an organized, efficient work crew. They formed a line from the well to their camp, hidden a half-mile away in the low, dry hills. In a quiet, disciplined rhythm, they passed bucket after bucket of water, transferring it down the line in water skins and clay vessels. Elara stood on her porch, the Winchester now leaning against the wall, watching them. The warriors were careful, respectful of her property. Not one of them approached her house uninvited. They moved with a purpose that was both humbling and intimidating. Kian, his leg propped up, sat nearby, acting as a bridge between their two worlds. "The gold hunters," he said, his Spanish improving with practice, "they're called the Dust Devils. They're led by a man named Silas Kane. He's a hard man, cruel. Wears the teeth of a bear around his neck." As the day passed, an uneasy routine settled over the Double C Ranch. The Apache warriors worked tirelessly, their movements swift and economical. Elara, feeling a strange pull to contribute, baked a batch of cornbread, using up a good portion of her precious cornmeal. When it was done, she offered it to Kian. He looked surprised, then pleased. He took a piece and passed the rest to the warriors nearest the house. They ate it with an unspoken truce, the silence between them fragile. This unexpected sense of normalcy was shattered in the late afternoon. A plume of dust appeared on the southern horizon, not the swirling dust of a whirlwind, but moving with intent. A scout perched on a high rock outcropping let out a sharp cry. Instantly the calm at the well dissolved. The warriors vanished into the landscape, melting back into the earth with a speed and silence that was breathtaking. One moment they were there, and the next the ranch was as still and empty as it had been at dawn, except for Jada Kian and a handful of elite warriors, rifles held at the ready. Kane Kian spat his hand instinctively, going to the hilt of his knife. Elara's heart hammered in her chest. The prospectors. They must have seen the Apache activity from a distance, or were coming to investigate the fresh water they knew must be nearby. Her blood ran cold. To be found here with Jada and his warriors would be a death sentence. You must go inside, Jada ordered, his voice low and steady. Kian didn't need to translate. The command was clear. Elara's fear clashed with a stubborn streak of defiance. I will not hide in my own home. Jada's eyes flickered with respect. They will see you. They will ask questions. Let them. Elara replied, her hand instinctively finding the familiar grip of her peacemaker. The riders grew closer, about a dozen of them. Rough-looking men with faces obscured by dust and grime. They rode with a swagger, rifles displayed proudly in their saddle scabbards. Leading them was a big man on a powerful black horse. Even from a distance, Elara could see the glint of something pale around his neck, the bear-toothed necklace. Silas Kane. Jada and his men concealed themselves behind a rocky outcrop near the barn. Their figures blended seamlessly with the shadows, and Elara remained on the porch, forcing herself to appear calm, just a homesteader going about her business. Kian, too weak to move quickly, had slipped inside the house out of sight. Silas Kane and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the house, the animals kicking up dust that settled over everything. Kane's small, greedy eyes scanned the property, lingering on the well. "Howdy, ma'am," he drawled, his voice grating on Elara's nerves. He didn't dismount. "Silas Kane," he continued, "me and my associates are prospecting down south a ways." "Elara Wade," she replied, her voice tight. "What can I do for you?" Kane's gaze swept over her, insolent and appraising. "That's a mighty fine well you've got there. Water's been scarce down at our claim," tainted Elara said flatly. "It's a deep well," she added. "Mind if we water our horses, maybe fill a few canteens?" He didn't wait for an answer. It wasn't a question. It was a demand, veiled with politeness as thin as a sheet of frost. "I suppose," she said, her mind racing. Refusing would invite immediate trouble, and she knew it. His men dismounted and crowded around the well, laughing and talking loudly. Kane's eyes narrowed. "Smells like cornbread," he remarked, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Didn't take you for the entertaining type, Mrs. Wade, living all alone out here." His gaze dropped to the ground near the well, where the earth had been trampled by the Apache's moccasins. It was a detail the Apache had overlooked in their haste. Elara's heart sank. Kane dismounted, his boots thudding heavily on the hard-packed earth. He walked over to the well, eyes scanning the ground like a hawk searching for any sign of movement. He crouched down, picking up something from the dust, a single small blue bead. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "Well now," he muttered softly, his voice low and threatening. "What have we here? Looks like you've had some visitors, the kind who don't wear boots." He turned to face her. His smile vanished, replaced by a glare that could burn through stone. "You've been dealing with the damned Chiricahua Marm, giving them comfort, helping those murdering savages." The tension in the air was palpable. Kane's men halted their rough talk, their hands instinctively resting on their pistols. Maeve was caught in the snare. The lie choked in her throat. Her face, her inability to meet his gaze, was a silent confession. "Figured as much," Kane sneered. "We've been having trouble with them Reds. They're like cockroaches, and anyone who helps a cockroach—" He took a step closer to her, his voice a growl, "is just as bad." From his position, Kian watched his hand tightening around his rifle. Kian had given his word to protect Maeve. He was about to keep that promise. But just before the Apaches, could reveal themselves, a new player stepped into the deadly dance. From inside the house, a cry of pain echoed. It was Cian. His wound worsened by his hasty movements. Kane's head snapped toward the house. "Who's in there?" he demanded, his hand drawing his pistol. "You got one of them in there. With you." The situation was spiraling. Maeve stood frozen between two deadly forces, the ruthless prospectors and the hidden warriors. Her ranch was a powder keg, and Jeddah Kane had just struck the match. The next few seconds would decide who would live and who would die at the Double C Ranch. The cry from inside the house lingered in the air, damning and irrefutable. Kane's eyes, burning with cold fury, fixed on Maeve, his pistol now aimed squarely at her chest. "I'm going to ask you one more time, ma'am." Kane's voice was dangerously calm. "Who's in that house?" Maeve's mind raced a whirlwind of terror and defiance. Behind her in the shadows of the rocks, Jeddah and his warriors stood ready to strike. Maeve knew that once they revealed themselves, blood would flow. Kane's men were outnumbered, but they were heavily armed and cornered. They would fight like caged animals, and in the crossfire, her home, her life, everything she had would be destroyed. She had to buy time to find a way out of this impossible situation. "It's my ranch hand." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth as she stammered it out. Kane's sneer said he didn't believe a word. "A ranch hand." His voice was laced with disbelief. "Funny, I don't see a bunkhouse, and I haven't seen anyone but you. Let's take a look at this ranch hand of yours." He gestured with his pistol toward the door. Get him out here now. Maeve was trapped. To refuse was to confirm his suspicions, and it would likely get her killed. To bring out Cian would sentence him and everyone else to death. From his hiding place, Jeddah saw the standoff. He saw Maeve's bravery, her lie to protect them. The debt of honor weighed heavily on him. His grip on the rifle tightened. His warriors, tense with anticipation, had arrows nocked and hammers pulled back on rifles. The air hummed thick with the promise of violence. But just as Kane took another step forward, a new sound broke through the tension. A frantic, high-pitched bray of a mule, followed by a string of curses in Spanish. An old man came stumbling around the side of the barn, leading a stubborn, heavily laden mule. He was a familiar face, Ignacio, a traveling merchant who passed through every few months selling anything from pots to gossip. He was harmless, a fixture of the region. "Mrs. Wade! Mrs. Wade!" He cried out, relief and surprise mixed on his face as he took in the armed men. "Forgive me, I did not mean to intrude, but my cursed animal, she will not." He stopped short, taking in the scene Maeve held at gunpoint. Kane's menacing posture, the tense silence of the others. Ignacio's eyes widened, but he had survived decades in this territory by being quick-witted. Kane, momentarily distracted, swung his pistol toward the old man. "And who the hell are you?" "Ignacio, senor, just a humble merchant," he said, raising his hands in peace. "I have come to trade with the good lady of the house." The distraction was enough. Maeve acted in a flash. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She did the one thing they'd never expect. She lunged forward, not at Kane, but at the sturdy little table on her porch that held her sewing basket. With one swift motion, she sent it flying across the porch. The sharp sound of spools of thread needles, buttons, and heavy iron scissors crashing to the floor startled Kane. For a moment, his attention was diverted. That was all it took for Jeddah to act. It wasn't the flash of gunfire or a storm of arrows. It was something far more terrifying. A single piercing war cry split the air from behind the rocks, a sound so raw it seemed to tear the sky itself. It was the signal. From all directions, Apache warriors rose from the earth, emerging like shadows, summoned by dark magic. They didn't charge, they simply appeared, lean and lethal. Their weapons aimed at the stunned faces of Kane and his men. One moment they were facing a lone woman and an old merchant. The next they were surrounded by the ghosts of their worst fears. One of the younger prospectors, His nerves snapping, made a fatal mistake. He tried to raise his rifle. An arrow, swift and silent as a breath of wind, flew from the shadows, striking him in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his rifle and staggering back. Cain, to his credit, wasn't a coward. He spun around his pistol, coming up, swinging from Elara, to the far more immediate threat, Jada, who now stepped from behind the rocks, a figure of command and strength. Cain spat, his voice a mix of hatred and grudging respect. Cain, Jada replied calmly, his voice cold. You've crossed into my land and you've threatened a friend of the Chiricahua. That was a mistake. The two men stood facing each other across the dusty ranch yard. The fate of everyone there hung in the balance. Cain's men were surrounded, outmaneuvered. Any further aggression would be suicide. Your fight is with me, Apache. Cain growled, his teeth clenched. Not with a woman. Her fight has become mine, Jada answered simply. You and your men poisoned the water of Ojo Caliente. You've brought sickness to our children. For this there must be a reckoning. But not here, not on this ground. He gestured to Elara's house. This land is protected. The woman who lives here showed my son honor. Jada continued. We will not dishonor her home with the blood of dogs like you. The insult was deliberate, a sharp goad. Cain's face turned purple with rage, his knuckles white on the grip of his pistol. You will leave, Jada commanded. Leave your weapons, all of them. And you will leave this territory. Do not return to the springs. Do not return to this ranch. If my scouts see you again, there will be no second warning. The demand was humiliating. To be stripped of their weapons was to be left defenseless in a land full of dangers. But the alternative was certain death. One by one, with murderous looks on their faces, Cain's men reluctantly dropped their rifles and pistols to the ground. The sound of metal hitting hard earth was the sound of defeat. Cain was the last to surrender. His eyes, burning with venom, stayed locked on Jada, but he saw the cold certainty in the Apache chief's gaze. He saw the dozens of arrows aimed directly at his heart. With a snarl of fury, Cain tossed his pistol onto the pile. This ain't over, Jada, he spat. It is, Jada replied, his voice final as the strike of a hammer. Now go. Without their weapons, the prospectors seemed to shrink, their arrogance replaced by fear and humiliation. They mounted their horses, their movements clumsy with anger and defeat. Cain shot one last hate-filled look at Elara. It was a look that promised retribution, a reminder that, even if he left today, she would never be truly safe. Then they rode away, a defeated posse, disappearing into the shimmering heat from which they came. A collective sigh of relief passed through the ranch. Tomas, the old merchant, crossed himself, muttering a prayer in Spanish. Elara's legs finally gave way, and she sank onto the porch steps, her body trembling uncontrollably. Kian emerged from the house, his face pale but determined. Jada approached her, his expression unreadable. The debt is paid, he said with Kian translating his words. You saved my son. I have saved your home. Elara's gaze shifted to the pile of surrendered weapons, the grim-faced warriors now collecting them, and then to the retreating dust cloud of her new mortal enemies. The immediate danger was over, but a chilling certainty settled in her chest. This was not the end. She had been drawn into a conflict much larger than she ever imagined. She had faced the devil at her doorstep, and with the help of the most unlikely allies she had survived. But the devil now knew her name, and he knew where she lived. The fragile peace was shattered, and the future of the Double C Ranch was more uncertain than ever before. In the aftermath of the confrontation, an eerie silence fell over the Double C Ranch. The oppressive tension had broken, but the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Silas Cain and his men had retreated their departure, leaving a sour stain in the air like a foul odor that couldn't be shaken off. Elara sat on her porch steps, the trembling in her limbs slowly fading as a heavy realization settled in. Her life had irrevocably changed. Jedda's warriors, moving with the same quiet efficiency as they had at the well, gathered the prospectors' discarded weapons. The pile of rifles and pistols stood as both a symbol of their victory and a stark reminder of the enemies she had made. Jeddah approached her Kian at his side. The great chief stopped in front of her, his gaze heavy with something deeper than triumph, a somber gravity. Silas Kane is not a man who forgives. Jeddah said, his words relayed by Kian. He will not forget this day. He will see you as the cause of his humiliation. I know, Elara whispered the cold truth, sending a shiver down her spine. She was a marked woman. You are no longer safe here alone. Jeddah continued. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a fact. My protection goes beyond a single day. The debt of honor is not so easily settled. He gave a quiet command, and two of his most trusted warriors stepped forward. These men are Jace and Zeke. They are hunters and silent watchers. They will remain in the hills. You will not see them, but they will see you. If Kane returns, a signal fire will be lit, and we will come. Elara stood, stunned into silence. The very Apache people she had once been taught to fear were now her sworn protectors. The irony of it all almost overwhelmed her. Tomas Moro, the old merchant, approached them, his hat in hand, a look of awe on his face. Elara Wade, he said, to have the friendship of Jeddah. This is a greater treasure than all the gold in these hills. He promised to return soon with supplies and news, becoming a link to a world that might now see Elara as a traitor. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the Apache warriors made preparations to leave. They had the water they needed, and the immediate threat had been dealt with. Kian, leaning on a makeshift crutch, came to stand in front of Elara. My father does not speak such words lightly, he said. But he thanks you. My life was in your hands. You showed kindness when you could have shown fear. The Chiricahua will remember the woman of the Double C Ranch. He reached into a pouch and pulled out a single beautifully crafted eagle feather. Its tip was stained a deep crimson. This is a symbol, he explained, of courage and honor. Show this to any of my people. They will know you are an ally. Elara accepted the feather, its lightness deceiving her. It felt like it carried the weight of a powerful bond, a promise forged in mercy and sealed in conflict. Jeddah mounted his horse, a magnificent animal that seemed to share its master's proud spirit. He looked down at Elara one last time. He didn't smile, but in his eyes was a deep acknowledgement. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of respect, a silent salute from one leader to another. With a final nod, he turned his horse, and with his warriors following behind him, they rode into the twilight, their forms blending with the land until they were gone. Elara stood on her porch, the eagle feather clutched tightly in her hand. She was alone, yet not truly alone. In the hills, her unseen guardians watched. The fear that had once been her constant companion lingered, but now it was tempered with a new, unfamiliar strength. Her simple act of mercy had brought war to her doorstep, but it had also forged an alliance she never could have imagined. Her ranch was no longer just property. It had become a sanctuary, a place where a covenant had been written in dust and water. Elara Wade was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector and ally, ready for whatever the next sunrise would bring. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West. This story, like so many legends of the frontier, reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting despite it. It shows that a single act of compassion can echo in unexpected ways, and that the lines we draw between us and them are often as shifting as the desert sands. If Elara's tale of bravery and the surprising alliance with Jeddah's warriors captured your imagination, please help our channel grow. Take a moment to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great Western, and most importantly, subscribe so you don't miss our next tale from the untamed frontier. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Click that subscribe button now, and we'll see you next time with another legend of the West. Thank you for listening. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deep-fake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.